to put it in a more readable format, a more friendly format for the average person to read. I think that if you look at some of these other progeny, as I referred to them, you will see an overlap between what appears in the register and what appears in those volumes, and so there's some redundancy. But nonetheless, we are quite open and quite document sensitive through these various means of publication, and that's the beauty of the system. Not that there can't be more done, and maybe will be, but that's where we are at the moment. Any other comments or questions? If not, oh, I was going to say, you have to work fast here.
We talked very briefly about this beforehand, but in the 1950s, the Federal Register Act was amended to authorize the president to create alternate filing procedures in an emergency. Has your research revealed, or can you provide us insight into what the intent was at that time and what the expectation was regarding alternate filing procedures?
I don't have a lot of detail on those alternative arrangements. Twice, the Federal Register Act was amended to accommodate, in one case, a hot war, World War II. It was amended in '42 to toll the first compilation publication on a regular basis of the CFR, the Code of Federal Regulations, and that lasted for the duration of the war. The second time it was amended was in anticipation of a Cold War. It was in 1956. This was Eisenhower years. There was a lot of planning going on, civil defense. The threat was a nuclear holocaust. And so the question was, would the register continue, or would there be an alternative system? I suppose a good question was, who would be around left to read it if it were still available? Things looked pretty dire back then. But there was some thought given to an alternative system that might be in a limited distribution kind of form. We had thought about relocating government to other cities. It was all a great race on wheels to see what could be maintained. As we bring that forward now into our own time of dealing with 9/11 kinds of matters and other disruptions of a major nature, we realize we have the internet, we have some government systems that parallel that, and so continuity is probably a little easier to maintain, but it raises one heck of a problem of verification of the validity and the reliability of the materials that might be distributed in an emergency situation through those networks. As part of cyber warfare, it's entirely possible that knowing that Washington is dysfunctional and we're relying upon electronic systems, that our enemy who had attacked us might also distribute false documents, false orders of the president or other such directives. So we have, the issue remains, and it's one that I know is being struggled with at various levels in various quarters, including this one, where we stand. So we have yet to await for the outcome there, but it's still perking, even though the document is rolling off the presses. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering, at the beginning, I'm assuming that there was quite a variety or differences in how various agencies would formulate their regulations, but over the years, now they're more or less follow certain standard formats about public comment and matters of illustrations in their documents and things of that sort. And I'm assuming that there's been a lot of influence by the office that publishes the Federal Register and sort of telling, in a sense, the agencies how to do that, but I'm not sure about that. So how has that worked out over the decades?
Prior to the Federal Register Act and the creation of the Federal Register, what was considered a regulation or an order or a rule Could be almost anything. It could be a press release. There were agencies that had telegrams in their files, and these were binding. Hence the reference to Bentham and secret law. It was chaotic. Most agencies issued little pamphlets with their regulations in them. You could go around, you know, it was the attorney's job here in Washington, go around and collect these things. Maybe there was a bunch of them at the law library, at the Library of Congress. But they would quickly go out of date. I mean, things were going on like crazy here during the New Deal. So the Register came to bring that situation to order with a central publication arrangement. And the CFR, of course, was the codification of the content of the Register. With the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946, you then got a uniform or a set of standard ways in which rules and regulations were created, notice and comment, and that process is still going on. Regulatory agendas and various other mechanisms, because the regulatory process has gotten not only more complicated, but of course the cost has gone up. Cost in terms of contending with it by an industry, and the cost of not contending with it, that you could lose, or that you would be damaged with the inadvertent loss of a trade secret or something of that nature. So the beat goes on, and as I said a moment ago, we're still looking for ways to refine the system. Even though it is redundant in places, it's still very much an ongoing process. Yes?
I'm curious about your research on Woodrow Wilson's views, his lament that there was no national newspaper, and apparently that there ought to be opinion published in this national gazette. Was that some sort of counterbalance to the notion that the Congress had all kinds of speechifying in the congressional record and that the executive branch should offset that, or how do you see that?
Well, I think you have to think back to the newspapers of that era, the pre-World War I era. This is the era of Pulitzer, Joe Pulitzer, and William Randolph Hearst. Editorials often appeared on the front page of these newspapers, and the reporters knew how to report the news, because if they didn't, they'd get fired if it didn't have the right slant. This was the golden era of yellow journalism, and it was a much different world. The Washington Post, the New York Times, the New York Sun came close to being a national newspaper, but they really weren't. They were still New York-based or wherever they were from, and they still had this slant. Wilson had studied the situation as a political scientist, and particularly was interested in the molding of public opinion. The official bulletin was a step in that direction. It contained a lot of war news. It contained lists of those injured and died in battle and those who received decorations. It reported on military operations, both on land and at sea, by our American armed forces. So it had a slight newspaper quality to it, but its real value was as a gazette. That is why, when Roosevelt first heard of the idea of this thing, he said he didn't want the government in the newspaper business. He remembered the bulletin. He had been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the Wilson years, and so he didn't want that creature coming back. He'd also had his own problems manipulating the press, so he wasn't certain he wanted one more dog around the block here. And it was a major obstacle to overcome, I think, among many members of Congress, that it was not going to be a newspaper. And of course, the nice snappy comeback was, it's going to be just about like the Congressional Record. Oh, well, that's fine. We all like the Congressional Record, don't we? Yeah. So there was a little equality there, and a little sense of not having this thing appear to be too newsy, i.e. propagandistic, getting out of control. That Gillette Act is still on the books, and we call public relations people other names. We get around that, but the stigma is still there. When I was preparing remarks for today, I was reminded of a cartoon that late Walt Kelly used to draw, a little creature called Pogo. I remembered a strip that, well, it's a picture of Pogo, who was a possum, and his friend Albert the alligator going through the swamp, the Okefenokee swamp, and they come on a little bug who's got his head up against a log, and he's reading a huge book, and he's just laughing and laughing and laughing, and goes a couple more frames, and Pogo turns to Albert and says, "Congressional Record." You can't find a story like that about the Federal Register. It ain't funny. But there is at least an apt comparison. So everybody want to go back to lunch? Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Dr. Relyea. And I'll just offer to you in December, I think December 23rd, I think it's the last week in December, we'll have a follow-up program with the head of the Administrative Conference of the United States, October 23rd. Paul Verkeel will be here to talk about trends and strategies for improving the administrative structure of our federal government. So we invite you to come back and bring your friends and associates, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you all for coming.